Thank you all for coming. You know, Vancouver is the kind of place where I expect many of your speakers come to praise you. And it would be easy enough to spend an hour and a half speaking well of this city, particularly since I've come to know it. And not just the planning and the city physically, and its nature and its economy and its good luck to be in this part of the world, but the people. You know, the charrette I did have, the East Fraserlands charrette was one of the most pleasurable in terms of human interaction that I've ever had. It was the exact opposite of a California experience, where people are terrified of the future, essentially, and so everything is very scary and people are very suspicious. It's a very civilized place, and I look forward to working here again if I do. And it is a manifestation. I was just actually outside looking in and seeing that there were 4 or 5 chairs empty, just as 4 or 5 people showed up to finish a perfectly filled room. And I think that's one more manifestation of the perfection of the planning in this city, that you lay out this number of chairs and that they're perfectly filled and everybody's on time and quiet on the hour. This is the exact opposite of Miami. I love it. I completely love it. Now, I was speaking to Mr. Price and disappointed to actually find out that this isn't just students. I thought I was lecturing what my little schedule book said was Simon Fraser University, and I would say, praise the Lord, finally I can speak of theory instead of reality, which is sordid enough. The way I earn my living is engaging reality. But nevertheless, I did prepare an academic lecture, and that's what you're going to get. I hope that you agree with me that planning at the level of theory is one of the most interesting things that you can engage, and that the reason it's interesting is it's about yourself and your manifestation as humans in relation to nature. It's really the way we manifest ourselves in the world. And so this is a chance for an academic lecture, so you have to indulge me. As I was standing up here and I put up my little plan of Portland, one of you said, must every lecture begin with a plan of Portland? And this is our best shot in the United States, the plan of Portland. You probably know better than I do its history, its rise, its current tentative situation. But actually, there was one event that you should know about. I used to be a very popular lecturer in Portland because I would come in and, like you here, I would praise Portland, and they loved that. So I was invited 2 or 3 times, and I was shown around, of course, the delightful parts of Portland, and with the assumption that the delightful parts of Portland here in red were a result of the urban boundary. And I wanted to see the urban boundary. And at one point, I had some free time, and I said, I'm going to go see it. I actually want to go see what an urban boundary is. And I got in a car, and all by myself, I went to see it, what it was like. And I realized, and it felt like escaping the clutches of my handlers. You know, the people that were taking me from one great victory to another of planning. And as I went to the urban boundary, I realized that most of the growth that had happened in the first 20 years of the urban boundary, was suburban sprawl within the boundary. What I saw in here were housing subdivisions, strip shopping centers, shopping malls, and office parks, exactly as in other places. So between the 1920s and 30s neighborhoods, which in fact are the glory of Portland, and the growth of the 20 years, sprawl of the worst kind had happened. And I said, in fact, it was worse than some other places. I said, how could that be? And I realized that what had happened is that the environmentalists, the well-intentioned people, were so pleased at the security of the urban boundary that they were literally out here on guard, guarding the edge, and not scrutinizing and contesting what was happening inside. And so what happened is the developers had a free run, literally a free run, for 20 years to build whatever they wanted. And I actually gave a lecture to that effect, and when I did, I was never invited again. However, and I want to take some credit for this because they were shocked. This had not registered. They took it to heart, and what you're seeing now in the second 20 years of the urban boundary is an attempt to retrofit the very many mistakes of the first 20. Okay, so there's an earlier Portland that was really absolutely childlike in its belief that the urban boundary was all that it was about, and a much more sophisticated campaign which is going on now to fix it, to fix what's happening. So let me differentiate those two. But how did that happen? It happened because the environmentalists were specialized. The environmentalists, which in our society stand for the best intentioned people, the guardians, the people who guard the future, the people who not only guard nature, but presumably the well-being of humans, were too specialized, and all they knew was nature, and they did not know how to assess urbanism. So long as the densities were high, things were fine. And what I want to speak to you today is how important it is for those of you who are environmentalists to not only become conversant with issues such as that density, in fact, is part of the solution, but a whole series of other things that behoove you to know. In other words, it is no longer enough to be an environmentalist that is an expert in nature. You must also become an expert in culture. Nature and culture must be continuous. Yeah, you need to know about humans. Humans are a species. They are, in fact, endangered. You must have heard that in the newspaper. We are now the greatest and most recently endangered of species. So just extend your area of concern up the evolutionary scale, and let us study the human habitat and see what it is that the humans need. Because right now, they are going literally nuts. They're so ill-served by their environment that they're going crazy. And so crazy that there are places that will actually shut down growth, which is actually suicidal. I'm not going to speak of Canada, but I will speak, for example, of a city where I worked 3 months ago called Sunrise, Florida. And when the word came in that the elementary schools had dropped by 3,500 students in 1 year, they were pleased. Because they said, oh, great, growth is stopping. But what that meant is a place without youth is a place without a future. So here was a society in suicide mode. Good, fewer humans, that's better. Okay, obviously, that is a really sick situation. So what is it that we need to know? And by the way, this is all theoretical, but let me also place it another way. The environmental problems of the world, global warming, are a direct result of the lifestyle of the North American middle class. Okay? It's the North American middle class and how we live, how we consume land, how we drive around for the most elementary things, how we amuse ourselves by consuming, that is causing global warming. And we are exporting that to China and India. And that's what's going to do us in. So when you look at the new urbanists, of which I am one, and you say, well, these people, they're dealing neither with the poor nor with the rich, with the wonderful patrons that commission these magnificent buildings by the star architects. You know, we're merely dealing with the middle class. I would propose to you that we are at the very heart of the problem. It is the middle class that is causing the problems. The poor are consuming very little, even in these advanced countries. They're taking transit, they're living very tightly, they don't throw many things away. And the wealthy are still too few to make a difference in this world. It is the vast North American middle class that is causing the environmental problems, so we need to address this. Okay. It used to be, I used to show this slide, and I used to say, now that this has been essentially secured with a vast array of legislation, the wetlands legislations, the endangered species legislation, a heroic generation was able to pass legislation to the extent that if you want to be an effective environmentalist, now you become a bureaucrat. You know, if you want to really administer and preserve that wetland, you join government to administer it, which means it's been stabilized. Essentially, it has been institutionalized. And I used to say 10 years ago, perhaps in that lecture in 1991, that I don't remember, but apparently I gave, I would say now is the time to look at this part of the environment, and environmentalists must cross from this to here. And I just said, let's do it, but I did not have a theoretical proposition that presented the human side to the environmentalists in a way that they could accept it. The proposition that I'm going to make is that there's a way to analyze nature that, if extended, can be used to analyze urbanism. And it's a tool called the transect. And it's a tool that some of you may know implicitly or explicitly, but it's fundamental to to how environmentalists is conceived and administered. And it comes with the idea of habitat. In the 19th century, at the turn of the last century, 1900 or so, an American professor from the University of Wisconsin came up with the concept of habitat. And habitat was the notion that in certain geographical areas, the species, the animals, the flora, the fauna, the minerals, and the microclimate were symbiotic, that they actually needed each other. You know, that this bird needed that worm, and that worm needed that soil, and that soil needed that humidity, and that humidity created the tree that housed the bird, and it was symbiotic. This, which is so incredibly normal to us now, had to be conceptualized. The 19th century had no conception of habitat. If it survived, you could move it. You know, so they would take bamboo to England and braid fruit there, and kudzu to Texas, and Australian very thirsty trees to the Everglades, the Melaleucas, to drain the Everglades, and they generally made a huge mess of the world by shoving everything around. Because if it survived, how could it be? After all, the humans were moving around just fine. They forgot that actually when humans moved around a bit, they died of disease and so forth, or they caught malaria, or they froze to death. You know, that it wasn't so easy to move even humans. But this conception of habitat is fundamental to the administration of environmentalism. When a developer finds an endangered species, such as, for example, in Florida, the gopher tortoises, I mean, theoretically, if there are gopher tortoises, you can grab them, they don't move very fast, pull them out, throw them in a truck, and take them somewhere else and go ahead and develop the land, right? And you really can't, you just say, just don't kill them, don't eat them for lunch, they're quite edible. You know, and we're fine. Well, that's not the way it works. They have to stay there, they're happy there, they will thrive there. This was a conception. Then there was a second conception about habitat, which was called the transect. And it was discovered that habitats concatenated. That the habitat here was actually related, let's say, this is a wetland, concatenated with an upland, with a marsh, concatenated with the high marsh, and I can't quite read it, but this is the herbal border, and then it says something else here, and then something else, and essentially what happens, you begin with the low wet areas, and you end up with the granite tops of mountains. And you get algae down here, and you get basically very, very little. What are the plants called that grow in rocks? Lichen. Okay, don't bring lichen to the beach, it doesn't work. And don't take algae up to the mountain, it doesn't work. But they both had a place. And so this concatenation of habitats, also called in its origins the valley section, was fundamental to environmentalists. So you get the habitat and you get the concatenation of habitats. This is a typical drawing right here of that period. Okay? Now, it wasn't invented by Gleason. It turns out it was discovered by von Humboldt, the great German explorer and botanist. And the first transect ever drawn, which is astonishing, was a cut from the Atlantic to the Pacific across Argentina and Chile, believe it or not. And here it is compressed, and here you get von Humboldt actually drawing in little bits of writing, not only what he finds on the surface, but what he finds underground and what he finds atmospherically. Okay, this is absolutely extraordinary. And what he did with this when he finished, he got on a boat and showed it to Thomas Jefferson, who he figured was the other guy that could understand it. This was the turn of the 18th century. And Thomas Jefferson had just written something called Notes on the State of Virginia, which spoke about the situation in Virginia, except he didn't have a diagram. So they got together and they had a chat. Quite interesting. It disappeared for 100 years. And then at the turn of about 1905, you get this very famous diagram. This is by a Scotsman called Geddes. And Geddes was a polymath. He knew everything about everything. He did the most amazing things. He was a developer. He did the plan for Bombay. He did the plan for Tel Aviv. And he came up with a drawing that was called the Valley Section that every planner knew. And it went from hilltop to water, and it showed each of the environments, right? You know, and here you see rocks, and here you see pine forest, and here you see woodland, and here you see crops, and here you see water. And what he did that was interesting, fascinating, is he tied it to human activity. Humboldt did not tie it to human activity. Geddes did. And here you see, for example, on the rocks there's a miner. In the forest there's a woodsman. In the woods there is, in the pine forest there's a woodsman, a hunter, a shepherd, a peasant, a gardener, and a fisher. This was all about exploitation, very 19th century. If you see it, if it moves, you kill it, right? If you see a rock, you break it up and mine it. You know, if you see a grassland, you bring the sheep over to eat it. The reason that this disappeared, and this diagram only disappeared from your textbooks in the 50s, was that it was so incredibly politically incorrect to, in fact, exploit nature. But what was interesting is that he concatenated natural activity and human activity. Okay? And what we, the new urbanists, did about, I would say it's getting on 15 years ago, as the second generation of new urbanism, we came up with a diagram that begins with nature, okay, which is nature, natural, rural, suburban, general urban, urban center, and urban core. And we have different degrees of nature. Of course, natural is nature intact. The rural is nature tampered, but essentially open space. Suburban, you know what it is, etc. And there was a concatenation. We began to conceptualize different degrees of the natural and different degrees of the urban in appropriate relationships. The degree of open space required, the types of trees, etc. And what I'm going to discuss today is this as a basis of thinking. Because one of the things that is happening all over the United States, possibly all over Canada, certainly in Portland, is that the environmental assessment of the city is greening the city by naturalizing it. And what happened in Portland is this. When Portland realized that many things had gone wrong and they became militant, and I remember I went to a meeting and there were people literally raising their fists and say, we will not stop till there's a woodland in every square and a trout stream or some kind of salmon stream by every road. And it was all about, you know, daylighting creeks and bringing nature into the city. Don't put trees all in a row in a monospecies, bring the grasses that are natural and so forth. And there is a very marked tendency now to create density, high density, without urbanism. And high density without urbanism actually doesn't work. People are miscued. And let me just give you an example that is absolutely almost a paradigmatic example. One of my friends lives in Portland where they woodlanded one of the woods, one of the squares. And you know what he says? I can't go in the morning because my dog is always picking up condoms. See the problem? There's nothing wrong with sex in nature, okay? Or let me put this, sex outdoors, so long as it's in nature. But a woodland in the square, where people come in with their kids and dogs in the morning, is not the place to do that. It's in the wrong place. Okay, it's the wrong transect zone. You do not build a woodland which is subject to crime and outdoor sex in the middle of the city. Okay, and that is just a paradigmatic example of getting the habitat wrong. It's like putting the wrong species in the habitat. You know, it's like bringing a kudzu to to Tennessee, where it literally eats up the hillsides. Okay, these are some of the diagrams that this is a typical transect diagram or transect drawing that shows the natural, the rural, the suburban, the general urban center. And I just show it really quickly so you can see the kind of drawings, how they're representative. You know, yes, you can have a dam. Yes, you can have a single house, you know, a kind of guardian house or a lodge in nature. This is suburban, which at its best, this is natural. Very little should and can be built there. The trails are controlled. This is rural, which means nature is no longer virgin. You know, it's tampered, it's handled, but nevertheless it's open space. This is suburban that can be done very well or very badly. And may I say that actually the Vancouver area does this very badly. You know, your urbanism is superb. Your high-density urbanism, your downtowns, this peninsula that we're in is among the best of the late 20th century cities. But what I see in terms of your older and even worse, your newer suburban single-family houses, no one has paid the least attention to how you make a decent suburbia. You know, it's almost like it's beneath contempt. It won't be there very long. And so what's happening, it's typical of the Portland experience. We're not dealing with that. And so it's absolutely miserable. It's grotesque. And you need to pay attention to this because a lot of people live in single-family houses and are going to continue to do so. And by the way, I pay attention. Your many magnificent architects here in Vancouver, really good architects. Of the houses that I saw today, about 1 in 400 were decent architecture. Not 1 in 100. I can't even grant you, I was literally counting. And the architects won't touch them. And they will touch them, sure, if they're commissioned with big budgets, you know, if everything's just right. Yeah, I'll do a house. That's not what you have to do. You have to go there and engage, understand the people, understand the middle class, understand the developers and their constraints, understand the limits of technology, understand the budgets, and address this single family house. It's disgraceful the way that the good architects of this region have simply let them go. It's one of the fewest ratios of good to bad architecture, one of the worst ratios of good to bad houses that I've ever seen. So you get the rural, you get the general urban areas, which by the way are very nice. It's a higgledy-piggledy mix of townhouses, houses, small apartment buildings and so forth. You know, the bread and butter of the most exciting parts of the city are all mixed up, and that's the general urban. Suburban is monocultural, all single-family houses. This is general urban, side yard houses, townhouses, etc. And then there's the urban center, which are the high streets, the main streets with commercial, and then there's the urban core, which you're masters of. What you master are the corridors, which is T5, the urban center, and you're masters of the core, which are the high rises. And so we took these and we basically made them the new zoning categories of the new urbanist codes. And virtually everything we do now is not on the basis. Virtually every new urbanist, all, you know, the firms, not just our firm, but most of the firms code on the basis of transect. And I'm going to show you how everything comes up for observation. This is a taxonomic device that puts everything in order, from rural to urban, and it allows things to become symbiotic habitats. Every city has a transect. Every city. For example, this is Charleston. Excuse me, this is New Orleans that has its particular T3, T4, T5, and T6. This is Washington, D.C., and this is San Francisco, okay? And if you were to begin thinking this way, you would have to do it for Vancouver. You know very, very well that you would not interchange a Chicago tower for a Vancouver tower, right? It's not the same. It's the character of the city. Or a New Orleans tower is not the same as a San Francisco tower. Nor are the single-family houses the same. They're readily identifiable. The kinds of houses that are built in New Orleans, Washington, and San Francisco. And I think one of the things that you architects might do collectively is actually study not just the style. In fact, that's kind of dopey, what the style is, and not just, you know, the iconic examples, but ask yourself, what in fact in these 4 urban zones is the essence of Vancouver, so that you can reinforce it and not basically slip into, inadvertently, into becoming another place. Especially the T6s and the T5s that were so hard won. And by the way, you need to test them, because you can also become a cliche. You know, your tall, thin, elegant, glassy towers, you know, which gives such a harmonious, they need to be questioned. And I had a very compelling meeting and dinner with your new planner, Todarian, that was absolutely fascinating. And I could have actually stood up here for an hour and discussed what we discussed at dinner. It's very interesting. So keep questioning, but also keep learning as to what it is, the character in each of the transect zones. Now, for example, this is a little example. When we do a project, this is in the eastern shore of Virginia, we always do drawings to understand the principle of the transect zones of the eastern shore of Virginia. We look at the sidewalks, we look at the height of the building, the materials, the awnings or not. This is a T5. And then we look at the T4 and see what it's made of, you know, the kind of sidewalk, the kind of buildings. And then, of course, we look at the T3s. We usually begin by doing diagrams to say this is the essence of the place. And, you know, photographing isn't enough. You have to draw it. And once you draw it and you show it to the people in a public process, they trust you. Oh, if you were able to draw it, then it's a kind of warrant that you can understand it. And so this is a typical one of our analytical drawings. And in case it is important that the essence not be American, which seems to be very important these days, you can always look at our star country, you know, the impeccable, saintly Sweden. Which the architects always love, the pacifists love, the environmentalists love. Sweden is the touchstone of a place well run. The new Code of Stockholm is transect-based. What they basically did is they said, we have these 19th century, 18th and 19th century areas that are beginning to get towers. And it's actually incompatible. Everything is becoming like every other place. And so they have a new code that says when you work in this area, you have to pick up the typologies of that area and the syntax of that area. You know, the window to wall area. And when you work in the 19th century area, that's the typology, the perimeter block. And when you work in the modernist 1920s, teens and 20s, you work that way. And when you work in the 30s, you work that way. And what basically, it's an architecture not of its time, but of its place. And this is something that you must remember. One of the fundamental decisions you should make is, should the architecture always be of its time, or should the architecture be of its place? You know, it would be very, very wrong, it seems to me, in your beautiful modern downtown to build a postmodernist building or a traditional building. That would be an architecture that's not of its place. But this is the discussion. And let me show. Paris has decided to have Paris and Rome, by code, have decided to have an architecture of place. You know, the traditional 19th century Rome of Haussmann is virtually intact. If you want to build a high-rise out of glass, fine, we love you, the French adore, but do it in La Défense. The only modernist buildings that are actually allowed in the old fabric are the civic buildings. And I totally agree with this. Civic buildings must be fully expressive of the artistic inclinations of the architect. They must be fully expressive of the aspirations of the institution, etc. I understand that. Civic buildings must not be coded. When you get a Gehry, you don't code Gehry. You know, you let them go. But Paris has decided. Now London and Rome is exactly the same way. Rome is absolutely intact in its syntax, and then you cross a line, and you're in Renaissance Rome with impeccably. And then somehow you cross a line, and you're in 19th century Rome. And then you cross another line, and everything around you is 1920s Rome. And then you cross another street, and you enter a different world, which is 1950s Rome. And each one is entirely different, and the diversity is marvelous. The same thing here. So one of the things, now London, which is no mean city, It's a wonderful city, has decided the opposite. It has decided that all of its buildings everywhere would be of their time, not of their place. And that's why London permits high rises in its most delicate urban fabric, right there in the city of London, the most delicate. So those of you who are making fundamental theoretical decisions about your city should actually visit both cities and see what you decide. Stockholm, interestingly, tried an architecture of its time and now has gone back to an architecture of its place. Okay? And I'm not deciding for you. I just think that you should know that there are implications to this, and you should see it in the deepest possible way. Now, about the transect. The transect is not just some aberration either of the new urbanists or of the United States or of Western. These are 4 images taken from a 100-foot-long scroll, which is one of the famous Chinese scrolls. It is in the Museum at Taipei. I just took 2 clips. I couldn't show you the 100. And what it is, you begin out here in the countryside, you enter the rural area, you go to the suburbs, and then you enter basically, it's from the rural, or rather from the natural to the rural, all the way to the urban, in the Chinese manner. They do it differently. Like, for example, the Chinese seem to always build walls at the edge, and the lower density is inside. You always get a building at the edge. Sometimes the density is high, but there's no such thing as a front setback. And I've confirmed that generally in Asia, there's no front setback. There's always a wall there. What you do inside gets denser, but there's always a wall. What this scroll was, it was a code. It was a code for the pre-literate population, and it shows beautifully over 100 feet how you actually create an urban to rural transect. So there you have confirmation. Now let's talk about codes. You are here in Canada, you are of the British tradition in which planning is actually negotiated. The developer comes in, there's an elite bureaucracy that discusses with the developer what is to be done. That is very different from the American system. The American system is based on codes. We have rules, okay? And if you follow the rules, you can go ahead and build without further discussion. You only have to come discuss when you want a variance. If you don't like the rules, then by all means you have to come in and discuss and get voted upon. But it is not an empirical system, it is a rational system based on laws. They're surprisingly different traditions. They each have advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of the American system is that it's much more efficient. You really can't be held up if you follow the code. The disadvantage is that it's extremely rigid, and you have to do it the way you are, and it takes a lot of creativity away. So that's the system. The disadvantage of the Anglo-Canadian system with all the negotiations is that in fact you have an elite bureaucracy, and I believe your planners in Vancouver here for 3 generations have been absolute elite. The present one and the 2 past ones, which is the main reason you have a really marvelous city, and a certain amount of courage from your elected officials, obviously. That's a prerequisite also. But that negotiation also works very well. It just happens to be fantastically inefficient, which is one of the reasons you have a housing shortage and such hideously expensive housing. Because it's just amazing. There's no way to accelerate it. And so there's really a housing deficiency, which is what drives prices up. Now, you can get beautiful Vancouver with very expensive housing, or you can get hideous Houston, with very, very cheap housing. It's amazing what you get in Houston. Those are 2 systems. I suggest that you blend them a bit. I suggest that you keep your bureaucracies elite, but that your bureaucracies, instead of just writing, by the way, just today I was handed 3 papers, and I meant to bring them to hold them up for you so you recognize them, beautiful reports, which are entirely dependent on being persuasive. They have to persuade you to do it. They can't just tell you what to do. They explain everything very courteously. And that's very nice. It's a very humane system. It just happens to be inefficient. Anyway, it's one of the things you should know about. In America, we write codes. And so we have this system. We have 27,000 planning departments in the United States ready to administer any code you put in front of them. And so now the codes that they've had are perfectly horrible codes that have created suburban sprawl. But the planners are perfectly willing, so long as they don't lose their jobs, if you switch the books, if you take away this hideous code and put in a new code, no problem, smart growth or new urbanism will emerge. They're happy to do it. Just don't make it harder and don't make them decide anything, because that risks them. They hate discretion. As soon as an American planner gets discretion, they're risking their job. Now, what is it that needs to be coded? Literally everything. Everything from the tree to the street lights, to the curbs, to the drainage, to the quality of the concrete, everything needs to be coded. And one of the things you find, you may have noticed, is that a lot of the specialists, that planning is now specialized, you don't have the old generalists. This is a book, this is a drawing from Raymond Unwin's book. Notice how he draws not only the road, but the landscaping and the house, the buildings in 3 dimensions. That was what people were like, what the planners were like in the 19th century. They were all generalists. You cannot tell that Raymond Unwin was an architect, because he was just as good with plants and with civil engineering. You can't tell that John Nolan was a landscape architect. You can't tell that Harlan Bartholomew was an engineer, because all of them knew everything about everything. And that's what made the cities great. In the post-war period, people became specialized. The traffic engineers only know how to make roads, and they will happily ream out towns, right? The architects only know about architecture. Don't constrain me. Don't constrain me. I need the full liberty to do my object. I only know about architecture. The landscape architects, don't ask them to respond to the architecture. They're doing their own thing. Completely independent of either the road, and the traffic engineers are putting the roads through, quite independent of whether there are houses there, trees there, people there, dogs there. They just know the traffic. Everybody's a specialist. And by the way, the environmentalists only care about the green, but I've already made that case. What is destroying our cities is that everybody is a specialist. And so you end up with a city that's a cartoon. A cartoon. You know, you get the road painted a single color, the green painted bright green, the commercial painted bright red, the residential painted bright yellow. And by the way, the developers are really complicit in this. When a developer, let's say, and this is more America than here, because you've had 3 generations of planners teaching developers to do complex buildings, but in America, they say, don't talk to me, I only do townhouses. You know, I only do mansions. I only do shopping centers. I only do shopping malls. I only do office parks. I only do one thing. Don't confuse me. And so the American planners have this terrible difficulty of having to assemble, you know, half a dozen to a dozen separate developers to do a mixed-use building or a mixed-use project. Here, your developers have learned very well that you can actually do them all. But that is a situation in which that's the problem with specialization. These people don't like each other particularly. The civil engineers are not liked by anybody. The developers don't like the environmentalists. The architects hate the landscape architects because they're always bothering their buildings, everybody. And it's terrible to put them in a room because they have contempt for each other. So how do we do it? This is how I do it. I go to the landscape architect and I say, look, I don't want you to give me one landscape plan. I want you, or landscape standards. Give me 6 landscape standards. Give me 6. I would like to first give me the mixture of trees and shrubs and ground cover and composition that is the most rural. Then give me one which is the most urban. And by the way, the most urban could very well not have any trees at all. There's such a thing as a sidewalk without trees. You know, there is, and they're perfectly fine. And it's called Rome, by the way. So don't laugh. Okay? There's such a thing as a sidewalk. And then there is, between them, there's 5 settings. And the same thing goes for an architect. Like, for example, I tell an architect, I said, okay, in T6, which is the most urban, don't articulate so much. We want a very, very smooth spatial definition. But the more you get rural, where you're buffered by more and more plants and trees, you can articulate more. There's less discipline. You know, houses are the architect's favorite things because they can do whatever they want because they're buffered from the next house. If you put two houses designed two avant-garde houses by architects right next to each other, they destroy each other. They look ridiculous. So the landscape is always a buffer. So one of the things you might say is, in the most rural, permit any material, permit any degree of articulation. In the most urban, where you have to live 4 or 5 or 6 architects of the block, you really have to be more disciplined and harmonious. Basically, what a code does that's based on the transect, it says everybody, okay, everybody, go home and come back with 6 settings. No one ever writes one standard. You know, one of the most ridiculous things that I see is you go to a public works manual in the United States and it says sidewalk 5 feet. You're supposed to build a city with a 5-foot sidewalk, you know, all the way from a shopping street to a rural path with a 5-foot concrete sidewalk. How can you do that? You completely desiccate urbanism. You make it stupid. You remove its vocabulary. So in the interest of sidewalks, you can say, well, in T6, there, you know, I like commercial sidewalks that are 20 feet wide. You know, when you have really big stores, 20 feet feels really good with cafes. And then when you get to the suburban, frankly, a well-done suburban area may not even need a sidewalk. I've been able to observe that a really good rural road, people walk down the middle of the street. You see? And so why have one standard? You need all the standards. And I'm now going to go through a drill in which I show you how important it is to have all of these standards and to have them in order. Like, don't give me a berm at the base of a high-rise, okay? Because you miscue everybody and they think they live in the suburbs. And this is, I'm not making this up, and then they hate the noise of street life. There are high-rises in Florida in which the condo commandos come down and shut up everybody at 8 o'clock because they think they're living in a country in a 30-story building. Because when they come out, there's a little brick path with berms. They're totally miscued. They don't understand they're living downtown. You know, they should come down right on something like Madison Avenue where they know what they're buying into, which is street life. This is typical of the kind of diagrams we do, which incorporate the width of the sidewalk, the building, and you can see how the sidewalk begins wiggling, eventually disappears, how the landscape becomes curled, and so forth. And we used to do this very well. Let me show you an example. Okay, this is entering Washington, D.C. in the post-war period, basically Connecticut Avenue when you go in. You have a beautiful parkway in which you are absolutely in the country. A parkway is a glorious thing, as long as it's a 1930s parkway when the landscape architects, okay? So you're definitely in the country, and then you begin entering, and that's what you get next. This, by the way, is one of the streets that ends up in the White House. Okay, so that's C2, which is the equivalent of T2 rural. Notice what happens. Everything begins changing, the houses begin appearing, the sidewalks get wider, the intersection spacing. See? Same street. Now, a modern traffic engineering never allows the thoroughfare to change its character. You know, if it's a collector, by all means, it has to remain a constant section, and it'll ream through everything. It'll run exactly the same way, whether it's running through the landscape, through the open road, through the open landscape where cars can speed, and it hits a town, and out it blows everything out. You know, trees go, buildings die, commerce dies, no parking is allowed, etc. That's patently ridiculous. Every arterial, every collector needs to have different characters as it enters different urbanisms, because if not, they all become mutually destructive. And you see it right here. I'm just going to go backwards. This is the same street. And beautifully done. And I have half a dozen sets of slides like these. This just happens to be the shortest set. These are the things that a code might engage. Okay, everything from the degree of mixed use to the separation of the buildings to the building materials, even, look at this down here, domestic animals and livestock. You know, chickens in condominiums are not the same thing as chickens in single-family houses, right? By the way, cats in the countryside, you might actually question what they do to the local birds. We're not inured, you know, cats kill birds. So don't put them near endangered species because they don't know the difference, actually, particularly. They'll kill that gopher tortoise just as happily as any other tortoise. So you have to be careful about things. This is a very long list of things, and it includes absolutely everything that comes up for observation. Even and you can even, and I'll show you many of the things, just a sampling of everything, which is the discipline of urbanism, okay, from here to there. And by the way, degree of mixed use. This, of course, would be astonishing to an American. But in a modern code, everything has mixed use, even the single-family house. The single-family house can still rent a room. You can still run a kind of business there so long as you limit it. Let me give you the example of renting a room. In T2 and T3, you can indeed rent a room. Here in T4, you can have up to a bed and breakfast inn, you can have a bed and breakfast inn up to 8 people that only serves breakfast. Why not more? Because it overloads the parking, upsets the neighbors. In T5, you can have a hotel up to 250 rooms, and in T6, you can have a convention center. You see how everything is intensified depending on the transect zone? That's not the way modern codes work. Right now, the codes are either you can do lodging or not. It's an on-off switch. It's either commercial or not commercial. It's either hotel or not hotel, right? It's either a single-family house or, by God, if you rent a room, that's illegal, and don't try to have a business because we'll bust you. It's like, you know, planning hasn't caught up with the fact that the internet has created the home business again. You know, that is the great transcendental effect of the internet, is that people can work at home. Now, over here, you can't have a client, and you can't have a sign much bigger than, you know, an address board. Over here, you can have a limited number of clients and so forth. But this can be defined, but there's no such thing as a single setting. Every one of the transect zones is about complexity. This is a summary of one of our codes that shows everything that comes up for observation here, and it shows how it runs in each transect zone. That is an entire code. What's missing is the language that activates it. Trees, for example. Trees have different shapes. Trees have different performances. There is a tree, for example, that was planted in downtown Fort Worth, which is perfect. It's a perfect tree. It loves, but you know what? The birds love it. And so they shit on all the cars. And so no one parks. Okay, now, that should be in the code. I'm talking about something completely humanist, like that tree, which you would write here, I don't know what the species is, don't do that in urbanism. You know, and then there are other trees that break up the concrete, and other trees that can't take root pressure, and other trees that if you put them in T6, the branches will bang into the signs and upset the merchants. You know, and right now, how are trees selected? By landscape architects or others who do it? Oh, decoration. They're like decorators. Oh, what a nice, I love that tree. I simply adore that shrub. You know, because there's no criteria. Everybody has become a decorator. Everybody has become a pseudo-artist because there is no criteria for designing things. You know, and all they know is, well, not only do I adore it, but it won't die. And that's the two criteria for establishing landscaping. You see? A problem that makes the cities completely incoherent. Now, that doesn't mean you might not get a masterpiece. You know, there's half a dozen landscape architects in this continent that are absolute masters of doing whatever they want and pulling it off. But a code is not about genius. Okay? You do not test a code with a genius. You test a code with an incompetent. And in fact, you test the code with a rather energetic and confident incompetent. Which is why, by the way, which is why I love second-year architecture school students. We always test our code, because they're full of confidence and know virtually nothing. So they're perfect, perfect lab rats for codes. Here's a tree in the wrong place. It's been breaking up the sidewalk for 100 years. There's also a difference between the urban and the rural. This is called a passage, and it is urban. This is called a path, and it is rural. Notice that this is gravel. Notice that it's curvilinear. Notice that this is hard packed. Notice that it's stone. Criteria, elemental criteria. Why should we even bother to write this down? Do you know why? Because when you hand over to an American landscape architect, this is the only thing that ever comes out. Do you think they're going to be paid for drawing a straight line of a single material? That's sub-specialized. And not only is the architect, not only does the landscape architect not think this is worth it, neither does the client. Why should I pay you to do a straight line, of concrete? You know why? Because this is urban, and it's called a passage, and this is what's used to come from the back to the front, and this is the way it looks. And not everything has to look like this, because you end up ruralizing the town center. And there is a difference between a park and a plaza. Lo and behold, there are actually paved areas that can be beautiful. By the way, in our codes, every parking lot has to be designed as a plaza. When you design a parking lot as a parking lot, it's horrible when cars are there, and it's still horrible when cars are gone. When you design a parking lot as a plaza, it's not so horrible when cars are there, and it's perfectly delightful when cars are gone. Do you realize that every square in Europe is also a parking lot? But you don't think of it as a parking lot, you think of it as a square. And you pull up your little table, and the cafe is right next to the parked car, and it's not that it's unpleasant or not, it's just that you don't look like a loser. You've been in a plaza in Europe, you've seen many plazas in Europe in which the cafe is right next to the car. You are a Roman. Okay, you pull out your little table in front of an American parking lot, and you are a loser. You are like when did this person emigrate? Yesterday? And it's the same stuff. We're talking about pavement, we're talking about car, we're talking about table, we're talking about human. The same ingredients conceptualized differently. Because people don't make that distinction, some notion of that should be in the code. Lights. I've actually seen landscape architects, or rather public processes, in which people come up and say, now what light shall we have? And then somebody comes up with a clipping that says, oh, I love these. And then somebody says, I hate these. And somebody says, well, we need dark sky. So you're sitting there, the planner is sitting there, and you get the dark sky contingent that wants to look at the stars. And then you get the young kids who say, hey man, if there's no nightlife, I'm blowing this town. I'm not staying if there isn't nightlife. I'm driving to Chicago. And nightlife is bright lights. Because, that's when you hunt for genetic material, is at night, right? Perfectly biological analysis. So what's a planner? Do you really think that I'm going to stand up here as a planner and say you're wrong? You are wrong. Everything has to be dark sky, right? We need to look at the stars. We don't want to confuse the migrating birds. No. What planner can do that? I mean, you might as well shoot yourself in the head. In North America, no one is wrong. Everybody is right, because happiness is self-defined. It's one of the glories of our democracy. Happiness is self-defined, and what the planner cannot be somebody who bans. They can't be a moralist. They have to be an allocator. Now I used to ban things, and it was a horrible life. Half the audience hated me. Now I become an allocator, and I say, sir, you're really right. It's delightful to see the stars at night, and sir, it's really important to have a nightlife. I'm with you. I'm a nightlife person. I really don't like the start. No, you say, let us find out where we can do this and where we can do that. And that will be where the shops are, and that will be where the wide sidewalks are, and that will be where the sound ordinance says you can make noise till 11. And those who buy into that area know very well that they've bought into street life. And over here, we'll write a noise ordinance that says everybody to bed at 8 o'clock. And that's how we allocate this single bulb light, and only at the corners. And now, you know what happens? Because this is made on an aesthetic basis, what you get is kitsch. There are suburban subdivisions that have lights for reasons of pretension that were actually designed for Washington, D.C. on the main axis. I'm not making this up. This is a Washington, D.C. light, you know, for Pennsylvania Avenue. And you can go to subdivisions in Maryland that have them. And then you also find very delicate places that have cobra heads. In fact, this morning I saw an alley in one of your, in somewhere, and there was a cobra head on an alley just blowing everybody's retina out. and all the things. Well, you know, it's not that this is intrinsically wrong. This is perfect for highways. Just don't bring it into, you know, into the urban areas. And so it goes. You know, you begin putting the world in order. So you code that. And by the way, this, of course, in every city would have the specification of each light. This is the most beautiful thing I've seen. You know, Williamsburg, Virginia is a small American town, basically reconstructed in the 1930s with Rockefeller money. And it's an old high street town that's only 4 blocks, a total of 4, maybe 5 blocks wide. And it is completely delightful, completely fascinating. By the way, it's a place you visit. It's also a place where real people live. I took these pictures within 3 blocks of each other. In the edge, in the rural edge, there was this fence, which is obviously for cattle, right? And as I walk, and both these fences were in T1. These are logs that are split with an axe and just held together by gravity, right? Obviously very rural. And then as you go in, here you get the same logs, but this time they're notched in and they form a more formal pattern. And then over here, the logs have been taken to the mill, right? And they're all nailed this time. And over here, they've been to the mill and they're actually painted. And over here, they've actually gone to the lathe and they've been turned, much more urban. And then you get brick, and then you finally get wrought iron. Wrought iron would look idiotic here. But do you know how much of this kind of kitsch happens downtown? Every little drugstore parking lot that wants to ingratiate itself with the planning department in the United States offers 3 rocks, 2 shrubs, and a fence. And you go to American downtowns where this kitsch appears. Now, there's nothing wrong with this in the right place. Half the problem with kitsch, which is to say bad taste, vulgarity, is not intrinsically the material, it's the material in the wrong place. Now, there's a tendency now among architects, and it's pure fashion, to bring lumber downtown. Like the latest is to bring sort of very expensive clapboardy stuff on high rises. Let's just bring wood downtown. And many, many architects, by the way, only have a single style. They will build in the manner of myself, whether I build downtown or in the country. And you find, here's an example of the problem with that. I was once taken to a town, a little town in Florida, that was having a crisis, an absolute crisis, because actually, let me give you another example. Because I remember the names. In Birmingham, Michigan, was another town that was having a crisis. I went to see the crisis. A little bank had been built in a cute main street that was a glass box. And it was only 2 stories tall, and it was on the sidewalk. It was entered from the sidewalk. The parking was in the back. It was perfect urbanism. And the neighbors were literally in terror of what was happening to their town, because it was a glass office building in a small town, Main Street. These very same people, when they go to downtown Chicago, love the Mies van der Rohe building, which is exactly the same syntax. They love glass and steel skyscrapers, but they hated that little bank. Why? Wrong transect zone. Now, one of the things that an architect might do, particularly the more accomplished among you, who've got it figured out, okay, I know how to build my way and it's elegant, etc. Give yourself the discipline in your declining years of developing an urban and a rural mode. Give yourself that challenge. Like, how would I, with my design skills, build in the country in such a way that the people of the country will love it, and build in the city in such a way that the people in the city will love it? Because the problem with modern architecture is that it doesn't have a transect. Probably the only advantage of traditional architecture is not that it has ornament, it's that it has a transect. You know, the architects generally, the traditional architects, the pre-modern architects in the country build in the country manner, They don't build a barn downtown, and they don't build, stone villas in the countryside. Some do, but it is not particularly the way to do it. Let me be fair. Every generation of architects has violated the transect. But often it looks like kitsch. It's simply bad taste. It's only when you address the transect that it works. Let me give you an example. This is a highway in the United States, built in the 30s, that the people love enough to have a preservation ordinance. This highway, the Connecticut Turnpike, has a preservation ordinance. People love it. And among the things they love are these bridges. Why do they love that bridge? Because it's a rural bridge. It looks perfect in the countryside. These very same people would love the bridges in the Loop in downtown Chicago that are made out of steel, right? Because it's the correct transect and syntax. And this is a house that I vacationed in a few years in France. It was a house designed in 1950 by an architect trained in 1900. And it was the most peaceful house I have ever been in. And it was just a box, a peasant box. And there was something so right about it. And I realized that the transect, which is a fractal, by the way, the transect can work at the level of the region. It can also work at the level of the house. The house, as you approach it, the same stone took 4 degrees of finish. As you were out in the vineyards, there were boulders in their raw state. As you approached the house, the same stones were roughly cut like this, right? And built in with little growies. And then as the steps approached the house were like this. And then when you got into the terrace, it was polished. And when you went indoors, it was highly polished. The same stone in 4 transect settings. Let me give you, and that's incredibly sophisticated, incredibly peaceful. There's an architect we have called Antoine Prédoc. You must know him, he's one of the famous ones. He was asked to do the town hall and he became famous building in the desert. He's a great desert architect, wonderful guy. And he was asked to build the town hall of Austin, Texas, which you can go visit. What he did is he built a building made out of rough cut stone, boulders literally, with a waterfall and grasses. If you get near that building with a jacket and you happen to rub against it, you tear your jacket. He built a rural building downtown. It looks perfectly idiotic. Now, of course, nobody who paid for it thinks that. They just think it's merely ugly. Okay? Or they think it's funny, but they give it nicknames. But the problem with it is he built a rural building downtown. He broke. It was a flagrant transect violation, and that's why it doesn't look right. It's just simply a discipline. It's a syntactic discipline that this architect doesn't have. He just thinks it's inspiration. And he had discovered Austin stone. He came in from the desert, says, Austin stone. I adore Austin stone. Of course, I wouldn't want to polish it. It's too beautiful straight from the quarry. So he builds a pile of rocks in the middle of downtown Austin and makes a fool of himself. Another thing that you can do, by the way, and this is how I treat a friend. Another thing that actually is quite interesting, many architects have built houses that were built once and represent a huge amount of time investment. It's almost unethical for an architect to spend as much time as they do in a single house that's built only once when the world is starved for design. Starved for design. You know that little Chinese restaurant out there? Or Asian restaurant, beautifully designed? There's more design in that restaurant than in 4 square miles of suburban Vancouver that I saw today. You get these incredibly skillful people allocating on very small projects. Every time I see a house, and I saw 2 very beautiful modern houses downtown, I said, wow, I'd love to be able to buy that plan. Now, I can't afford, the $100,000 it took to commission it, but that plan is sitting in some architect's drawer, and that architect owns that drawing, and that drawing should become available. And one of the things that I'd like to see is architects to pull out built and unbuilt projects that they have in their drawers and make them available. And the way that we propose to make them available is to create plan books like these and actually assign them with transect zones here. You see that little code there? That code tells you the width of the lot. Right here, it tells you the transect zone. it tells you the climatic region, etc. It even tells you the market segment. Like this house is for, it's a starter house, for example. If this were put in a computer, hundreds of marvelous and perhaps not so marvelous houses would become immediately available and pre-approved by the code. Anything that has received that designation is simply pre-approved for that transect zone. Because one of the things that's important about the 21st century, ladies and gentlemen, one of the things about modernity that is unassailable is it involves large numbers. It's all about large numbers. It's not about abstraction, it's about large numbers. Huge funds, very great speeds, enormous growth, like the growth you're going to undertake. And I've seen the reports. In the next 40 years, this is going to double in size in 40 years, this city. We're not talking about the last 40. It's not going to be like the last 40. It's all about efficiency. How do you maintain quality with efficiency? And this, among the things that is very important that you're going to have to confront, is that every project can't take 4 years to permit. Every building can't be tailor-made. You can't go for permits every time you want to build a house. You can't have 50 inspections to build it right. You won't keep up. You'll choke and die. You'll wither and die. People will go elsewhere. People are already saying, I love Vancouver, talented people, but I can't come here. Companies recruit young, talented people, and they can't come to Vancouver because they can't afford the housing. And you know who's at fault? The inefficiency of the system, because there's no theory that allows anything to happen quickly in this city. You've got the excellence. You've got the excellence down. Perfect, wonderful way to spend the last 30 years to achieve excellence. Do you know what's next? It's not excellence. It's quantity. How do you do excellence? That's the challenge for Vancouver. That's what's in the books. How do you do excellence in quantity? And I would say that pre-permitting certain buildings, particularly their design. By the way, another thing that's possible, there are tons of young architects here full of talent that in fact can't connect with clients yet. They don't know how to do it. But what if they design buildings and put them into this system that could be downloaded by developers and sold? By the way, I'm thinking about selling plans for $10,000, which at one level, you can't do the plan originally, but you sell 10 of those and you can live for a year. And you can live very well as a student. You might even be able to pay your tuition. So what this does is this empowers young talent. Everything, all these little film clips that the young people are doing, have you noticed the architects aren't doing that? The architects are not projecting themselves into the internet trade. The filmmakers are, everybody else is, but the architects, no. I have to be commissioned the old way. I need to be paid properly with a, Come on, get on with the 21st century. Connect to this. And then there's just simple tragedies. Okay, here, this is an engineer whose book calculates this. This is downtown Fort Myers. That is designed for a highway. His public works manual only has one setting, the highway, and furthermore, it's all about perfection. Exactly 2 seconds after the last raindrop falls, this road will be dry, lest the tires get wet. The little tires, okay? There's a gold plating, and so this is one kind of just simple comical idiocy, but this is tragic. These are people desperately trying to live in the country. They've bought themselves country houses. Right? They've bought themselves large lots. They've paid by living a great distance out, and the Public Works Manual does not permit the creating of a rural road. That is exactly the same standard as used in downtown Chicago. Exactly the same drainage, exactly the same height of curb, everything. One setting destroys the possibility of living in the country. And I see that all the time. No one is allowed to build a rural road anymore. You can only build urban streets. And they're very unecological when everything is taken and shuttled down straight to the river without being cleaned. But the fundamental extension of what I'm saying is this. This is a traditional city with the grid, urban, walkable, extremely desirable Alexandria, Virginia. Over here is Tyson's Corner, famously as dense as Washington. Tyson's Corner has more offices than Washington. It was the first of the edge cities. You can go to Tyson's Corner and you'll find no one walking, despite the density. It is the epitome, it is the poster child of density without urbanism. Why? Because the rules are written in such a way that everything is suburbanized. You can only cover 45% lot coverage. Insidious things, the way a parking lot is designed, in a slope, the minimum slopes, force the parking lots to be away from each other. You can't slope a parking lot slightly, although you can slope a parking garage, but you can't slope a parking lot to that extent. So you have to build a horizontal parking lot, and the next one, when the hill comes down, has to be moved down with a big swath of green in between. So you get these incredibly rural areas, everything buffered, beautifully administered code. This, after all, is Virginia, really beautiful, the most beautiful state, etc. We're going to have parkways everywhere. We're going to have enough cars. And you end up with this suburban mess in which everybody drives there, despite the fact that it has the same density. This is not a matter of taste. This is of fundamental importance. People will not live in density willingly unless they have the compensation of urbanism. A garden apartment is to be consigned to an inferior lifestyle. Listen, there are lots of people that willingly live in density and give up their yards. But in exchange for what? In exchange for street life. But to live in an apartment in the middle of the woods, why would you give up your yard? All right, to live in a garden apartment. Just remember this statement, because it's a bumper sticker. You cannot have a townhouse without a town. Okay? And that is exactly what's being built all over the suburbs. Lots of townhouses with little postage yards and a parking lot in front instead of an active main street. The transect, a code based on the transect would eliminate that, because you can't build a townhouse unless it's keyed to a frontage, which is urban, which would then be attached to a place that is a walkable mixed-use destination, so you get street life. This is a beautiful thing. This is Washington, D.C. This is actually called Washington Avenue. This is a four-laner, an urban four-laner, a rural four-laner in Rock Creek Park. Isn't that beautiful? The rules are different. Here, the speed is different, the lane width is different, the parking, the swales, the recovery zone, everything is different here from there. That does not occur in the standards. If you have a four-lane collector, it's the same section all the way through. Thereby, what you do is you destroy the country and you destroy the city. One of the things that the code can do is, for example, you can easily write a code that says, in an area of this size, let's say that this says minimum 4 units to the acre, minimum 6 units to the acre, okay? And everybody has to be on a street, etc. This is what you get. There's no way you can call for a town unless you get a bureaucrat, an administrator saying, twisting the arm of the developer and say, I want a corner store, I want townhouses, I want everything. How do you administer the making of a town? You write a code that says no area can have fewer, no pedestrian shed, this is about a pedestrian shed, can have fewer than 3 transect zones. The density has to be triaged into 3, and you have 3 transect zones. The minute you do that, then you get this. You see, there's a transect zone here that is the big lot that takes care of the countryside, while the developer still makes some money. Essentially, nature is preserved. And then you get the single-family houses that form the bulk of the town, and then you get the T3, which are the townhouses, and then you get the T5, which is mandatory retail. So you take these rules, and like a Chinese cook, and everything is pre-cut. Have you noticed that Chinese food is real fast? Right? They'll just throw it in. Well, there are only 7 ingredients in the kitchen. And they're all pre-cut. So they get a wok, and they throw it in. That is exactly what you need to do in the 21st century. You need to have extremely sophisticated transect zones. Complex, excellent setbacks, totally environmental, but prefabricated, so that when the time comes to quickly do a project, you don't have to spend 4 years administering it. You can say, look, I want 4 transect zones here. Boom, it happens immediately if the rules are properly written. It's really all about Chinese food, future planning. That's the model. Suburbia is this. Now, This is something, there's a mistaken belief here that urbanism is all about density and suburban sprawl is all about low density, right? People believe that in Canada. People believe that all over. Not so. It's not about density or not. You can have very high density that is still suburban sprawl where people have to drive everywhere and there's no society and there's no defined public space. You can also have places made virtually entirely out of single-family houses that are completely urban. And don't tell me you can't because Canada is full of delightful towns that are principally single-family houses. One of my favorites is Niagara-on-the-Lake. Have you ever seen Niagara-on-the-Lake? An absolute masterpiece of urbanism, of mixed use, of walkability. It's all single-family houses except for the high street. So it's not about the density. It isn't just about the urbanism, it's about the entire set of ingredients that make things urban or not. Here's an example. These are very similar programs. This is suburban sprawl. Suburban sprawl is the houses and the shops that feed them, that supply them, but you can't walk from one to the other. Regardless of the proximity, you can't walk from the closest house to the closest shop, even though that's a 1-minute walk. Everybody has to get in a car, go out to the collector, take up capacity, find the shop, and create yet another patch of asphalt, of which there are 4 for every car in the suburb. By the way, the cars are nice. Don't attack the cars. They're nice. They're super. They only become negative because of the asphalt they stupidly create and the trips that they're stupidly made to take. The cars are wonderful, exactly like in the TV ads. Short little trips in beautiful European plazas, or long-distance trips in the landscape. If any TV ad actually showed how a car is actually used in Canada, nobody would ever buy a car. Because it would be just to be in traffic and in miserable parking lots. The new urbanists adore cars. It is a mistake. It is a mistake. What do we want to do? We want to allow, to give the, not to ban them. We always provide parking. In America, we're not punitive. You can't just say, you shall not have a car, or a car, let alone a car. You shall not have a parking place. That's ridiculous. We provide all the parking places necessary, but we allow the option of walking. Okay? And that's why it is so easy to swallow. That is what's so market-oriented. Why would you want to drive to that very short destination when you can walk, and the walk is interesting, safe, and rewarding at the end? Right? Why would you not take transit when you can walk to it? Why would you take a car and then park and do an intramodal change to take transit? You have to walk to transit. You can't drive to transit. Once people get in the car, they tend to continue driving, right? All of these things are well known. In the suburb, everybody drives. Now here in the city, look at this, and I want to now make an analogy. People say that there's choice here. There is no choice in the suburbs. If you think there's choice because one house is bigger and has a 3-car garage, and one house is smaller and doesn't have a garage, or one's a townhouse, that is not choice. You're simply getting a smaller or bigger house. Because everybody in the suburbs lives exactly the same way, which is to say in isolation, because you drive everywhere for everything. That is the characteristic of the suburbs. You can make a place of houses that is not suburban, that is urban, because you have the choice of walking, and transit works. Niagara by the Lake, and I'm sure you have towns like that. Now, this is a town. It's a northern, it could be in Canada. Let me show you how it works and the true diversity of living. Here, people who are young can find housing above the store. Why? Because it's cheap. The real estate has been, this is like a strip shopping center, right? It's just like this, but instead of wasting the top, you build housing which is affordable. And you know who likes to live there? The young, because that's where the action is, as I said. You know, where the action is where the genetic material is, and it's their job to sample it. To widen, the principal reason we send kids to college, I believe. And let's say you successfully mate and you have offspring. You have cubs. You can move to the middle distance here, where it's nice to live in a little house, a starter house, with a little yard, probably for the dogs, because I don't think kids are particularly interested in yards. They're interested in wheels and pavement. And the kid, at about age 6, can walk to a whole world. They don't need to be driven by their moms. And I've seen this. If you don't think this is true, go to Kentlands, which is our biggest project with 7,000 units. The kids walk everywhere all the time. The mothers tell their kids, see you tonight. And they have little charge accounts at the stores, etc. Little kids walking everywhere because it's traffic calm, there's lots to do. They go to the movies. I mean, I could tell you stories. It's wonderful to watch. So you go to the middle distance when you're a young family. As you get older, most people manage to accumulate some wealth, and they reward themselves by buying more stuff. And they buy more stuff to need a bigger house. They also like bigger lots. It's how capitalism rewards you, is you can buy more stuff. Otherwise, you don't like your job so much. It's much easier life in communism where you only pretend to work. It's in capitalism, you work hard, but you get to buy stuff. So you get to live at the edge of the town in T3, where you live in isolation. Then as you get older, you say, you know, Martha, let's not go out to dinner tonight. I don't like driving so much. And you stop driving at night, and you stop driving when it snows, and you stop driving when it's cold, and then you drive only when you take right turns. You no longer take left turns. Okay? And then finally you say, oh, I shouldn't be driving anymore. Let us leave our house. And then what you do is you go to the retirement community, where you live for incredibly high cost in a little room and go to the cafeteria, just like when you were a teenager, and a little bus 3 times a week takes you to the mall. What we do with our seniors is we infantilize them. Now, there were no retirement communities that existed prior to 1950. You know why? Because what happened is people would sell their houses and they would come downtown, and they could actually, where they could totter around to their daily needs, because people can walk a lot longer than they can drive. So here you see the ebb and flow of life. When you're young, you're downtown, there's housing for you. As you get older, you go to the edge, you get bigger lots, and then finally, as you get older again, you come back. So you have the ebb and flow, you have the full transect on a lifetime basis, but this is also what's beautiful about small towns. And I love small towns, because small towns give you both the urban experience and the rural experience daily, not just in your lifetime. It's not just, and as I already met at least one person that when he was young, did his job and was in downtown Vancouver, and then as he got kids, he got himself a house. You know, he's following the transect of the lifetime. But I prefer small town living, where I love to go to the main street, and then I love to go to the country within a 5 to 10 minute walk. And I would now want to make one proposition that is totally shocking to environmentalists. Where does the theory come from that urbanism has to be contiguous? That the city simply grows by accretion like a stain? Whatever happened to the Garden City idea, so strong that at some point the city stops and then you establish new settlements, right? So that there are strong edges and that people don't get quite so far from nature. You know, there's somehow a proposition. It used to be, I grew up in my schooling was about cities that were finite, that you stopped them and then you founded new cities. That's Leo Creer's theory, that's Ebenezer Howard's theory, that's Eliel Saarinen's theory. And then suddenly I turn around and the environmentalists have gotten themselves, probably because of Portland, in some kind of funk that everything has to be within the urban boundary, and then the ink blot just keeps growing. I think that even that model should actually be questioned. And somebody asked me, speak about the urban edge. And I think the urban edge should not even be something that you reluctantly expand, like Portland or like Miami. We continually, very reluctantly expand our urban edge. But 1 200-acre project at a time, and the nature is so far from my house in Miami that literally I haven't seen it in 10 years. I have never been to the edge of Miami. I can't remember, it's been 10 years. It just got so far that I never go. So I would urge you to rethink this standard of the immediate agglomeration, immediately adjacent to the city. It's got some positive effects, but it has some negative ones. Animal corridors, just make the distance large enough that you can actually be in nature, that when you are in that green belt, you're not in urbanism, and that whatever environmental issues are happening, whatever species are walking through or trying to breed, they too try to breed, that they're actually far enough away that it can actually succeed, so that you don't get captured habitats. Now, once you establish, one of the great confusions is because our transect diagram is in order from rural to urban, everybody thinks that towns have to be like egg yolks, like fried eggs, right? With the center high and then feathering down into nature. That's just the diagram. Once you establish the zoning codes, every element, by the way, remember I'm talking about lights, landscaping, setbacks, densities, uses, curbs, everything. Everything in each of these is prepackaged. You can actually put them in radical juxtaposition. You can put T3 next to T6. You can put T5 next to T2. In other words, you can have radical juxtapositions that are very exciting. Look at how exciting that is. You know why Central Park is the most exciting park in America? Why? Olmsted did 200 of them. 200 parks. Some of them even more skillful than Central Park. What's exciting about Central Park is you have T6 in super adjacency to T2. And it's fantastic. Now, you go to Kentucky, or you go to New Orleans, and they'll say, we have an even larger Olmsted Park. By the way, why hasn't anyone noticed? Because next to the Kentucky Park are houses. You don't get anybody can see a house. You know, a house next to a park. Hey, what's so memorable about that? It's okay, but it's only these radical juxtapositions. One of the most exciting things you can do. You see, what I'm speaking about here is developing a vocabulary in which the planner can actually do masterful, radical things. Let me show you this example. This is my friend Javier Seneca Celaya doing his utopia. And what he did, Javier is an architect in Bilbao, and he says, what I would really like to do on the chassis, this is the chassis of Paris. This is the Ile de la Cité and the Ile Saint-Louis. So he took the chassis of Paris, and he said, Paris is too homogeneous for me. What I would like to do is I would like to live in San Francisco, have dinner in Paris, and go to the theater in Manhattan. You know, you see that thing? You can code that with incredible precision. You have the vision, you have the will, you have the tools. Now, I think this is a little Disney World-ish, but it shows you what, in fact, you can do. You can work with that precision if you actually have tools this refined. One other aspect that I think is very important and very much to the point of what's happening here in Vancouver, there's a densification program occurring. This city, in many of its reports, not just one, is slated to densify. How is that going to be done gracefully, and why are people so terrified? The people in the single-family neighborhoods are terrified. They're terrified that they're going to lose value. They're terrified of their neighbor, of the house becoming a quadruplex or a sixplex or a motel. God knows what horrible things can happen. You know why they're terrified? Because they have reason to be terrified. Because we've had 30 years of people, of codes that are too imprecise, and government that cannot be trusted, allowing incompatible buildings to occur in single-family neighborhoods. And eventually, that becomes hardwired in the society, and people hate change. By the way, people before the 1950s loved change. Change, great. Get me the future, I can't wait. Now most people are terrified of the future. California is so against growth because they've seen the future and they don't like it. But it all has to do with bad planning. When a new project goes in, all they do is lose open space. It just creates more traffic. What's in it for them? I just get more traffic and I lose the view. So what's in it for me? Nothing is exchanged. It's a downward trade. And yet, every city, and let's talk about the most environmental city in North America. You know what it is? Manhattan. Manhattan, which is highly paved over. It is, if you do what's called an ecological footprint in Manhattan, it's a disaster. The heat sink, the pavement, too few trees, all the sewage that goes out. But let me tell you, Manhattan is an environmental saint, because those people in Manhattan live in small units, they all walk and they all take transit. And that is, in fact, what is creating global warming. There is a belief put forth by the LEED system that it's all about buildings. It's all about green buildings. Between 1/3 and 2/3 of the carbon loading is from traffic. And LEED, the certification agency, has discovered that, and now they have LEED ND. LEED ND is the new standard. 46 of the points are about pedestrianism. And what's going to happen is that is essentially going to replace the LEED ND for buildings. It basically folds in the green building into the larger context, because if you put a perfectly green building, what the most ridiculous thing that finally set this off? The new urbanists started making fun of LEED when we said, you did a green Walmart. Perfect. Perfect. How environmental. With people driving there for a 35-mile market radius. Why don't you go ahead and do a green drive-through McDonald's? Just go ahead, go for it. Or that green environmental building for that famous, I think it's called the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, which was built very, very green out in the edge of nature. And every single employee half of which used to be able to walk and bicycle when it was downtown Washington, everybody has to drive. You see, there's this huge hole that is happening. It's not just about the buildings, it's how you get there. It's about the urbanism. And what you're going to be seeing is LEED, the LEED standards, and LEED ND is already out. It's been beta tested. I believe there are 80 or 800 projects. I think 80 projects being tested. It's about urban, how many? 200. 240 projects being tested. Now, among the things that are important about urbanism is to move successionally. Now, what's that? In nature, there's succession. Here's grass, shrub, young forest, even-age forest, and old-growth forest, which is called the climax forest. This is perfectly analogous in urbanism. In urbanism, let's take Manhattan. If you look at a series of lithographs of Manhattan over the century, the original Manhattan, the Dutch Manhattan, was exactly like a current Latin American shantytown. Mud huts, bad drainage, pigs on the street, the whole thing, urinals dumping, night soil to the street, just like Latin America, possibly worse. And exactly the same layout that had the shacks got brick houses, and the brick houses got 5-story apartment buildings that then became 20-story stone apartment buildings that then became 40-story skyscrapers that then became the World Trade Center at 100 stories on exactly the same chassis. Urbanism has an ability to grow and densify and mature just like nature. But suburbia does not. When you look at suburbia, when you look at a strip shopping center, do you think that can densify? It's either doing well or dead. Do you think a suburban subdivision ever wants to move on to the next? Do you think they look forward to becoming denser? No, everybody's terrified. Suburbia is conceived to stasis. It's like getting an insect and putting it in plexiglass. Everything about it is to prevent it changing, including, by the way, the Homeowners Association codes. And that's why the city cannot densify except with the greatest difficulty, because it wasn't coded properly to be successional. And by the way, something about old-growth forest that's so interesting. That old-growth forest is climax. Remember I called it? You know when climax is? Climax is when you decide that the city has reached a peak of perfection that you want to put a preservation order on it. For example, the 100 blocks of the Art Deco district in Miami Beach, the 100 blocks of the New Orleans French Quarter, no one wants to keep, that shouldn't be successional. Charleston shouldn't be successional. It's set. But you should not have a preservation order when you haven't matured. That's like as you grow older, only having short pants and sneakers. At some point, the city has to get a good suit. And you see lots of cities, and I'll not name names because it's a little bit insulting, in the suburbs of Vancouver, that if left up to them, they would become elderly teenagers. Or let's put senior citizens dressed like teenagers, which is a pathetic look. Completely pathetic, because they're unable to mature. Now, what's interesting, by the way, this is very interesting. You know what this is? This is Sacramento. Sacramento, California, the capital of California. Unfortunately, this was clipped by the PowerPoint, but what it says here, it says Sacramento, it's about 1878, and it says Sacramento, California, becoming a city. No, I'm sorry. What it says is the city of Sacramento, California. The city. Now look at it. Look at it. You know what that is? Those are pigs. You know what that is there? That's a mud hole. You know what these are? Shacks without sewers. But do you think these people said the shanty town of Sacramento, California? No, they said the city of Sacramento, California, because everybody in this continent came over here knowing that the original city was going to gracefully molt and become great, and they all wanted to become great. And it's suburbia that doesn't. What I would suggest that you do, look at this. These are the transect zones. T1, T2, T3, T4, T5, T6. You can see the maturing of the city, right? This is in the countryside, the farmhouses, the suburban houses, etc. You can see that happening. This shows you how sophisticated the transect is. It's not only spatial. This could be a series of cross sections as you enter the city. It could also be the same place over time. You can be damn sure that this place here at one point looked like that. Right? And that this one looked like that one. This city was able to mature. It's the weirdest thing in the world that somehow a city like Vancouver, which is half single-family houses, is somehow thinking that it's going to remain into the 21st century single-family houses. I ask you, okay, what planet are you from? Don't you pick up the paper? Do you see what's happening? And yet there's this graceless, really dumbed down discussion about whether things are going to happen or not. The minute you overlay a transect conceptualization on the issue, it stops being your house, my house, etc. What you do is you design a place where you move automatically every 15 or 20 years or 30 years into the next transect zone. So T5, when we write a code, we have a line that says this: every 15 years, each transect zone moves automatically up to the next transect zone unless in public hearing the citizens decide not to. So we set up an armature that actually gradually matures unless you have an intelligent discussion that says, you know what, we want to not become, this time around, the next transect zone. What doesn't work is when you discuss only one thing at a time, like, shall we have a garage apartment in the back, right? Or shall we allow in less parking? You cannot design it one city, you cannot decide it one issue at a time. You have to decide it comprehensively. Is this neighborhood or this transect zone going to become the next one? And what does that involve? And you know, at the beginning, people say, no, I don't want to change. And then something begins happening. I've done this. I did this in Birmingham, Michigan. I said, let's have a discussion, not about your house, but in general principles. What would happen if, for example, you were allowed to actually run a home business? And at first people say no, and then they say, you know what? I'm already running a home business. Wouldn't it be nice to actually do it legally? Maybe I can do a little addition. Maybe I can do it. Oh, you want to do an addition in your house? Well, what if we reduce the 45% lot coverage and we increase that to 75% lot coverage? Boy, that would be convenient, right? And then they say, well, would you like to have a garage apartment? No garage apartments. You know something? You know, my teenage kid, I really don't want him in the house. He's back from college. And then people begin thinking and say, you know, this is not such a bad idea. It's under control, it's predictable, everybody's getting, it's not about just leaping on to the next. You know, it isn't just leaping next, suddenly into 5-story buildings and apartments next to you. It's gradually moving up to the next transect zone. And you know what I found, which was astounding, is that every time I've done it, everybody wants to move to the next transect zone. Because most cities are ready for evolution. It's just that there's no concept that allows it to happen except in a kind of destructive way. And that's what the transect can do. The transect can also, by the way, remember I said the transect was fractal, that the same concept works at the scale of the building. As you enter the building, the materials go from rural to urban. It also works at the scale of the region. For example, this is your downtown. This is the peninsula we're in. This is the rest of Vancouver. These are your cities. These are your rural towns. You know how they're made? You know how you make them? Each of these consists of different ratios of different transect zones. So with 6 transect zones, properly calibrated to your climate and your culture and your environment and so forth, you can create the world. It isn't very complicated. Each of these is intrinsically complex, intrinsically sophisticated, intrinsically everything that's in your books that says, we want a diversity of houses, we want walkability. Each of these transect zones, in fact, has that built in. All you have to do to create a small town is to have a percentage of T2, T3, and T4. To create a village, let's say hamlet, to create a town, you have different percentages of these 4. To create a downtown, you have these. To create a TOD, what's a TOD? A TOD is half a mile of T5 and T6. That's what it is. You don't have to write a whole book. There's such a British inheritance. Every time you want to do something, you write a beautiful document. You know, what about writing 3 paragraphs of code, you know, of rules that will actually make it happen? You should try it somewhere. The other thing that happens, which is very interesting, is this idea that people are off-grid. You know, that people have green roofs, that people are going to have wind turbines. You know, wind turbines don't work in high-rises. It's pathetic. You know, you can't even, you know, if you have a wind turbine in a high-rise, you can't even light the buttons on the elevator with what you generate. So why bother the birds and create that whir that doesn't let people sleep? Wind turbines are not about T6, they're about T3. Composting, okay, great, we must all compost. Well, are you gonna do it in your bathtub or your balcony? Well, obviously you don't compost anything. You know, berms, this, you know, the glass, etc. Basically, every environmental issue, and there's probably an even dozen, each has its own transect zone. They make sense different ways. You know, from composting to recycling. You know, sometimes you really shouldn't have 3 garbage cans. You don't need to do that. It drives everybody crazy. It drives you crazy in the kitchen. It drives the poor trash man crazy too, right? Because they're already handling a 30-story building. I mean, already they're geniuses just to pick up the trash in T6. The smartest people I know are the trash men in New York. You know what it is? To actually, all of this is degrees of off-grid. Okay? Look at this. This is composting. On-site organic processing, self-drop collecting systems, optional competitive collection, mandatory curbside collection, centralized composting systems, smaller regional composting, on-site processing, reuse centers, recycling, all of these things. The encyclopedia of recycling. It's not absolute. If you write a single rule, you're going to crash, you're going to have opposition, it's going to take you 6 years to put it through the city council, all for the absence of a transect. Because once you say, well, this only has to happen in T1 and this only in T6, hey, there's no problem. And that goes also with chickens and eggs and cats and dogs and paint and everything. This is the great concept. This is what goes to show you why environmentalism as currently constituted is actually has been intellectually corrupted. By only having nature as a tool, it continually creates a misanalysis. Let's look at this. Okay, this is from T1 nature to T6 urban core. Conventional environmental analysis, which is about permeability, which is about not having heat reflectivity, which is about the ability to grow your own food as closely as possible. Okay? As you go denser, the environmental performance gets lower. Okay? The environmental performance gets lower. If all you have is a hammer, you treat everything like a nail. If all you have as environmentalists is nature, right, you treat everything by greening it, by ruralizing it. And therefore, the misanalysis is that while nature is a very high performer, unfortunately, suburbia is a higher performer than the urban core. There is the person who invented the ecological footprint, a man called Beatley, did an analysis of London that presented London as an ecological disaster. How could London, or let's say Manhattan, be an ecological disaster? How can a place like Times Square that has exactly 4 trees, but nevertheless attracts 10 million visitors a year, how can that be an ecological disaster when those 10 million visitors are in Manhattan instead of in Yellowstone bothering the bears? You see how you continually misanalyze the situation? You cannot have a conceptualization of environmentalism in which suburbia rates higher than the urban core. And yet that is the way the codes are written. The minute you put a creek underground, has anybody asked yourself, have you asked yourself how many creeks are underneath, are in pipes in this peninsula? Have you asked? You know what I estimate? 50 to 100 creeks in pipes. Okay? A disaster. Oh my God, the creeks are in pipes. We're supposed to stay 90 feet away from them. You know what this would be like with 90-foot setbacks? Every street would be clipped. You'd have no connectivity. The density would be 100th what it is. 100th. Because what allows this to be dense is the high degree of connectivity of the grid that allows this many humans to live happily in one place, willingly. The people who live in this peninsula are doing so willingly. They're not constrained by the urban boundary. They love living here because it's urbanism. The minute you follow conventional environmental rules based only on nature, you can't build this anymore. I don't think you should consider any rule that does not permit you to build this peninsula again. It's as if you were lobotomized. That should be the check. When somebody writes a rule, you say, yes. What's the name of this peninsula? Where we are? What is it? Does it have a name? Anyway, where we are. I want to get intimate with it. I want to learn its first name. This peninsula of high density, marvelous stuff, has got to be legal. What I find all over North America, I repeat this, is that people are inadvertently preventing the future building of a place like this. Because every creek, you have to stay 90 feet away from every creek. Well, you know what that does? That immediately creates a suburbia because you minimize the crossings, which means you get collectors, which means the traffic immediately chokes on itself, which means the density has to be low. It doesn't work. Now, here is the correct analysis. If, let us say, that we consider the currency to be complexity, let's say complexity, diversity. Diversity is the great word. We want ecological diversity, we want social diversity, okay? Ecological diversity as a single currency diminishes as you go urban. Now, social diversity goes up as you go urban. Right? There's no social diversity in the country. There's very little in suburbia. There's a great deal of social diversity at the core. This is where people of all types and all persuasions and all genders, all 6 genders and everything seem to be happy. Okay? There's a lot of diversity in the core. Lots of languages, lots of restaurants. Diversity is good. If we mix social and ecological diversity and natural diversity together, if we mix them both, in other words, we unify nature and society, if we understand that man is not the adversary of nature, but in fact part of nature, and you measure human diversity, then the diagram corrects itself immediately. It's excellent at T1, which is nature. It drops in suburbia, where there's neither natural nor social diversity, and then it rises again in the core, where there's very little natural diversity, but a great deal of social diversity. You immediately correct the diagram. You see? So the philosophy, which is bankrupt, the philosophy of nature-based environmentalism, which is bankrupt, and ultimately can never succeed because it includes human, every human is a problem. If you start analyzing the ecological impact of a human, you have to kill babies. Okay, I'm sorry, because even a Manhattanite creates 7.5 tons of carbon a year. By the way, a suburbanite creates 23 tons of carbon. So you can't do that. You cannot ever be doing that. Humans have to be within nature. Now, here you have, and if you think, whoa, that's been solved. There's another problem. You can't go around saying that houses are immoral. You see this thing? Oh yeah, we love nature, we love T6, now let's ban all the houses. You can't stay in office and you won't hold your job. What you need to do, this is the point. Here you say, you know, Manhattanites, T6 is, you don't have to do green buildings downtown. You don't have to do a green roof. People who live in urbanity are doing their job simply by walking and taking transit and living compactly. Okay, they're doing their job. Don't punish their buildings with additional stuff. However, the people living in the suburbs in those houses, they're a disaster. They're driving everywhere, occupying a lot of land. This is where you apply the green standards. This is where you say, you know, these buildings, they have to be LEED Platinum. Because you guys are a disaster. And this is where you shove up the center so that eventually what you do is you create a situation in which all of it performs environmentally, which means that humans then have a choice. Remember, in a democracy, you have a choice. You can live in T6, you can live in T3, so long as it's a very green building, and you can also live in the countryside. And you see, so by applying environmentalism and composting and recycling and bicycling, all mandatory in the T3 suburbanites, you stabilize and you give people the choice. And that is, in fact, where environmentalism is going to have to end up. I want to show you this, because in the end, this is the last slide. This is Manhattan before the skyscraper. Isn't that amazing? Somebody reconstructed it. Do you know how many creeks were in Manhattan? 2,700 creeks in pipes. 2,700 creeks. You say, oh my God, why don't we just daylight them, shall we? Well, not only is it physically impossible, I think a lot of people would say, no, 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 no. No, we love Manhattan, it's good. We don't want to daylight the streets in Charleston. We don't want to daylight the streets in downtown Vancouver. Do you know why? Because the loss of nature was compensated by something of equal value. People willingly lose open space so long as they get towns, villages, and city. What they can't stand is losing open space and get suburban sprawl. People will fight, not just for environmental, they will fight for a potato field if the loss is if it's going to become a shopping center. Because everything is a downward trade unless it is a village, a town, or a city. And you know how we know that? Because we know it instinctively. We know that there's something wrong with a strip shopping center, with a housing subdivision, with an office park, with an industrial park. We know there's something wrong, so we'd just rather have that potato field. And one of the things that has been damaging environmentalism is that we're beginning to invent false endangered species and false wetlands, simply to do whatever we can to prevent that shopping center from happening. We don't have to do that. You don't have to mangle science. You know, you don't have to come up with false wetland delineations. Just write a code that says, yes, we're willing to lose that so long as it is an even or upward trade. We will lose an open field so long as it's a walkable, pedestrian, compact village. But we certainly don't want to lose 1 square inch of dirt if it's going to be a piece of suburban sprawl. And it's right here in front of you. No one would restore, and it's not just the cost. You wouldn't restore Niagara-on-the-Lake to nature. You wouldn't. No one would do that. Not a single person would say, let's demolish it and get back the woods. Because Niagara-on-the-Lake, which is, I think, the most beautiful town in Canada, at least they say so, is because Niagara-on-the-Lake was a very distinct upward trade. Okay, so that's my last slide. I think that I don't know how much of this is new or how much of this you find sort of obnoxious. I hope that, above all, you find it stimulating and a way of thinking about things that will clarify your way in the future. Thank you very much.